Hi y'all. Chances are you're probably here because you have a research project or your other sources are just big chunks of text or a singular poem analysis. So I'm just gonna make this quick. I'm gonna go over Frost's history, then three of his poems, The Road Not Taken, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and as a bonus, Nothing Gold Can Last, and finally some critiques he's had and my take on it. In order to understand much of Frost's poetry, we need to look through Frost's point of view. On March 26, 1874, Robert Lee Frost was born in the city of San Francisco, as well as into instability. And early on, Frost's youth was overshadowed by the death of his father from tuberculosis when he was just 11. This loss eventually uprooted him and his mother to the foreign prospects of New England. Among the forests of New England, Frost developed a fascination with the way nature holds both peace and chaos at the same time. That contrast, the idea that beauty and struggle can exist side by side, ended up shaping many of the pieces of literature he wrote. And in a way, it's kind of like a yin and yang dynamic. And don't worry, this isn't some random one-time connection. I'll keep bringing this point up. But basically what I'm saying is that good and bad aren't exactly opposites. They're part of the same system. I think that idea really clicked for Frost in his early 20s, especially during one of his lowest points in his life. He had gone down to the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina, completely burned out, unsure if he'd ever make it as a writer. And honestly, he was so close to giving up, he basically wanted to kill himself. But something about the place, the stillness, the wilderness, and perhaps even the dismality, forced him to slow down. Interestingly, instead of finding despair, he found a new perspective. He realized life wasn't some puzzle you're supposed to figure out like a scientist in the lab. It was more like something you walk through and something you sit with. And before you click off this video thinking, holy this guy is so corny, there's a reason why I said that. During the time Robert Frost was alive, which was 1874 to 1963, there are three major events that occurred: World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. Why the fuck am I bringing this up? Well, I'm hoping at least some of you have seen some edits of people comparing how much people have developed just within the past 100 or so years, compared to the couple of 100 years before that. This is obviously due to the incredible scientific progress made during the 1900s and early 2000s. But my point is this: while the world around Frost was racing ahead, tackling massive problems with science, technology, and political ideology, from the horrors of the world wars to the tense standoff of the Cold War, Frost slowed down. Unlike the scientists who treated life as a puzzle meant to be solved, or politicians and idealists who tried to fix everything with their ideas, Frost believed that some things simply weren't meant to be figured out, or really he believed that some things weren't meant to be controlled. This is a massive idea. That Frost's mindset was radical in its simplicity. Specifically, he was okay with accepting uncertainty, embracing the quiet moments, and finding meaning not in solving life, but in experiencing it. And this mindset, the willingness to sit in ambiguity instead of forcing out answers, is at the heart of almost every poem he wrote. To further emphasize just how different Frost was, while many poets like Eliot and Pound revolutionized poetry through radical experimentation and literary rebellion, Frost quietly revolutionized poetry through a sort of radical simplicity. On a side note, a change in art, technology, philosophy, or human behavior is called modernism. Frost's work exemplifies these core ideas, particularly in its examination of modern life's complexities, ambiguities, and moral dilemmas. While many modernist poets focus on breaking down conventional boundaries through experimental techniques and fragmented narratives, such as Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein, who employ nonlinear historical references and fragmented imagery, thus challenging traditional poetic styles, Frost's style was rooted in traditional forms of poetry, further exploring common ideas such as choice, human struggle, and the natural world. These reflected concerns with the accelerating pace of society towards destruction and meaninglessness, which was another portion of modernism. Frost's unique ability to engage in modernist themes like existential doubt and the search for meaning, while not relying on an overt rebellion or radical stylistic changes, conversely allowed his voice to stand apart from others, proving that a quiet voice can speak just as loud as a call to arms, as well as capture the complexities of modernity that modernism questions. And I actually have a really good analogy to understand the significance. In elementary, we had a project where each student was to draw their own little person and add their own unique little touches. One student, though, made a plain old man with just a shirt and pants, no accessories or any decorations. However, seeing as everyone else's was so over the top, his was in a way the most unique. Going back to Frost, he proved innovation didn't require abandoning any tradition, which is what makes him such an integral cog of American modernism. Coming back to the yin and yang idea, Frost's poems can clearly be seen to parallel the balance of the two facets of the world. The Road Not Taken clearly shows both the tranquility of the woods with the quiet and solitary scenario, along with the struggle of choices and how these choices may change one's life. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening represents the tranquility of nature as well. The man gives in to nature, disregarding the struggle of societal expectations. Long before all that, though, Ross published his very first poem, My Butterfly, which appeared on the cover of The Independent, a New York City magazine that paid him $15. As mentioned earlier, Ross had struggled to prove that writing could be a viable career, but this small win helped reignite his passion. Not long after, in 1913, he went on to publish his first collection, A Boy's Will. Today, Ross remains a major influence in the literary world. He's the only poet to have ever won 4 Pulitzer Prizes and was even invited to speak at a presidential inauguration. There's no question that his work left a lasting mark on American modernism and beyond. Okay, I promise this is the last part before we get to the poems, but to really understand Frost's poetry, it helps to look at where it sits in history. Frost grew up during a time of massive change, when rural life was giving way to industrialization, urbanization, and a growing obsession with technological progress. The generation that had once grown up on farms, like Frost did, was now moving into cities and working factory jobs. These shifts changed both the landscape and how people related to the world around them. Workers were now selling the time of their lives, both figuratively and literally, to employers, and with that came a growing disconnect from the natural world that Frost had always been rooted in. Environmental consequences followed, including deforestation on such a scale that the Forestry Commission was created in the 1880s to address the damage. Now, for those of you who are really astute, you may know that Frost was part of the modernist movement, which might make no sense. After all, modernism is usually seen as its advocacy for progress, but in reality, modernist literature often questioned it. Modernism dug deep into philosophy and uncertainty, and Frost fits that mold perfectly. Take The Road Not Taken. On the surface, it's a quiet walk through the woods, but in context, it's a profound reflection on choice, especially in the era of World War I. People face defining decisions. Should they support the US? Should they go to war? These choices carried weight and often regret. Frost Beaker, standing at a fork in the road, becomes a symbol for the many people forced to make those irreversible decisions. When we place Frost's work within this historical backdrop of industrial expansion, environmental loss, and global conflict, it becomes clear that his poems aren't just an homage to the pastoral, nor just for nostalgia. They expose the cost of progress and the haunting beauty of what we leave behind. Now, with poetry. The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost is probably the most misunderstood poem of the 20th century, maybe ever, and ironically, it may have helped kill the guy it was written for. The poem kicks off with a man walking in the woods and hitting a fork in the road. He tries his best to examine each path, sees that one has a little more grass, but otherwise, it's basically the same. He stands there thinking about it, then takes the grassier one, believing that, since it hasn't been trampled, less people have walked on it, saying he'll come back to the other some other day. Though, he already knows that that's probably not going to happen. Fast forward to who knows how long, and the guy sighs and says he took the road less traveled and that has made all the difference. Now, usually this poem is seen as a celebration of nonconformity, where the man at the end believes that, that choice has made his life, and to be fair, I can't help but imagine the man in a mansion sitting next to a cozy fireplace with a bearskin rug on the floor, talking all about that choice. But honestly, I don't think that's what Frost intended. Specifically, that last part, the road less traveled. Because earlier, the speaker literally said the roads were the same. So which is it? Did he really choose the road less traveled? Or is that just what he wants to believe? Here, I like to split the poem into two interpretations. This does not mean these are the only two interpretations, but this is what I can personally see. Interpretation 1 is that the speaker is being ironic, kind of mocking the idea that there was even a right road in the first place. He is aware that the paths were basically equal, but later on, he rewrites the story to make it sound like he made some bold, unconventional choice, which tells us a lot about human nature. People want their decisions to mean something, even when they don't. The story matters more than the actual moment, but to be honest, this whole interpretation is basically it's about the journey, not the destination. Another way to look at it is that he's not lying or being ironic, he's just older and more reflective. He's looking back on the choice he made and trying to understand how it shaped him. Maybe the roads were the same when he stood there, but the choice itself became meaningful over time. Like he chose one path, lived a whole life because of that, and now he feels like that was the less traveled one. So even if the roads weren't different, the fact that he chose one and stuck with it is what changed everything. And then there's the sigh in line 16. On one hand, the speaker lets out a sigh of relief. In this scenario, the speaker is more aware of what truly happened and has gone wiser since his youth. He accepts the fact that the roads were the same, but still understands that throughout his whole life, just by believing that they were different, he has lived a completely different life than he otherwise would have if he had taken the other road, even if they were the same road in the end. On the other hand, the speaker lets out a sigh of remorse, giving off a more human tone. Here, the speaker believes that the path itself has affected the journey rather than the decision to do so, showing when he reveals his belief that way leads on to way. And by revealing his regret, the narrator reveals that he continues to wonder what his life would have been like if he had taken the other road. Going back to historical context, Roth once had a friend, Edward Thomas, who would come across forks in the road when they walked together. Thomas always had difficulty choosing which one to take. The scenario in which the narrator lets out a sigh of remorse is in a way mocking Thomas, making fun of his overthinking of which path to take. After all,
overthinking is just as bad as underthinking.
The scenario in which the narrator breathes a sigh of relief represents what Frost believes people should strive for in order to be satisfied. Not only is this another idea of Frost, that being human nature, but it eventually led Thomas to join the war, thus taking the road less taken, and leading to his death. Another idea of Frost is located in his imagery of yellow woods. Yellow wood acts as a sort of forerunner to the idea that one must make choices and deal with their consequences. Autumn, the season of yellow leaves, represents the middle age or the late adult stage of one's life. Frost being 41 when writing this poem, most likely intended for this symbolism to explain how choices are very much necessary, especially in contributing to where one ends up. And considering the historical context of World War I, it probably did hint at joining the war. Essentially, the description of Autumn hinted at or connected to the ongoing war, the road less taken being the choice to enlist, not being able to travel both in this case likely refers to the fact that if one had joined, then there was a high chance of not returning. On the more metaphorical bus, if one had survived, they'd still live with the consequences or guilt of war. But either way, a choice was to be made and lived with. No matter how far down the road one looks, no matter how closely one examines the road, at the end of the day, there is a decision to be made. Additionally, Frost mentioned that leaves no step trodden black. An interesting interpretation of this is that all decisions are unique. Whether the roads lead to the same place is a different story. The paths themselves are almost undoubtedly different, because as time continues, new leaves fall and cover the ones that had been trodden black, implying that new opportunities arise given the time. And the fact of knowing which choice was made is enough to completely change the view of how one ends up. This further enforces the idea that it is the choice, not the path, that made the difference. Overall, the road not taken is seen to be very ambiguous, which makes sense given how often it is misunderstood. More importantly, however, it represents one of Frost's favorite parts of writing, the power of poetry. Or in other words, the amount of different interpretations one piece of poetry can have just from ambiguity. Even a century after its publication, the road not taken remains strong. The world is obsessed with optimization and making the right choice, but the true significance of decisions do not lie in the path taken, but rather the motive behind the path taken and how humanity reshapes the narrative into something meaningful. And in that message, Frost has cemented himself as one of the last bastions of tradition. Poem number 2, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, is what Frost believes to be his masterpiece, and perhaps even the best representation of everything that he believes. The poem starts out with a man wandering in the woods with a horse. Stopping between the woods and a frozen lake, he takes his time to admire the surrounding environment. After a period of time, his horse tries to wake up his owner, but the man is completely zoned out, only hearing the wind and snowflakes. Finally, the poem ends by revealing the man has unfinished business to attend to, repeating the line twice before ending. Before diving into the hidden meanings of the poem, there are some interesting ploys that Frost employs. First off, the rhyme scheme. This poem is unique in how it chooses to format itself. The first stanza has a rhyme scheme of AADA, followed by BBCB, CCDC, and DDDD. This likely implies that the stanzas are somehow linked and strongly related. Additionally, just from the setting, Frost once again strikes with his love for nature. The Rodnartaken uses autumn to set the mood, while this poem uses winter. Winter is often considered the season of death, not just because it represents the end of the year, or in other words, a man's life, but it's also when all the agriculture dies because of the temperature. Accordingly, the first thought would most likely be that the man dies at the end of the poem, but Frost himself has stated in an interview that that was not his intention. In order to understand the true meaning of winter, the reader must look through Frost's eyes. Frost loves nature. He views it as a place for tranquility, and that's quite literally what this poem is about. The man wants to escape his responsibilities or promises to keep by relaxing in the tranquility of the snowy forest. On to the meanings of the poem. Arguably one of the most interesting lines are when the narrator brings up he, specifically bringing up the fact that he will not see me stopping here. There are two interpretations to this, the first being a religious one. Here, he refers to God, with his house referring to the church or even just his domain. But the interesting part is when the narrator bothers to mention that God will not see him stopping here, which is not only confusing, but makes it seem like he is trespassing. According to the Bible, God quite literally created everything and is always watching over you, which doesn't really align with what the man said. The only possible place I could think the man could be is hinted at when the woods are described as lovely, dark, and deep. Not many things can be described as both lovely and dark, but one that I could think of is sin. Lust, for example, is an example of a dark secret. It is something humans considered lovely. Given this, the best presumption for where the man is some sort of purgatory or some form of metaphorical hell. In this interpretation, the horse being described as little and thinking it queer to stop without a farmhouse near implies that the horse is trying to steer the man back to the glory of God. The horse being little to the man implies that he believes the horse is insignificant. This might be an homage to the idea of sin. The man represents the sinner, falling for the lures of some sort of trouble, only having the small horse, which represents his desire to do well and be a follower of God, to help him. It could also be seen that the horse is just being ignored by the narrator, who is already sleepy, falling into his unholy desires. Additionally, a nice detail that Frost makes is how he chooses to rhyme words. This idea was from GVRL&xid. I'll leave their video in the description. In stanza 2, the final words for each line are queer, near, like, and year. These words all have a pretty soft ending to them, which matches well with the fourth stanza, which also ends with eep, a sort of creeping sound, or in this case, falling out of God's glory. However, in the third paragraph, the final words all end with sharp-sounding sounds like shake, mistake, and flake. These sounds in the stanza about the horse are meant to wake the narrator up, to guide him back to the narrative of God. But for the man, he's already in his darkest evening of the year, or in other words, he is at a low. The second interpretation views the poem as an allegory, similar to how Journey to the West creates an allegorical framework for its characters. Here, the horse, much like the horse in Journey to the West, represents logic, reality, and even society. The man falling for an almost seductive-like nature of relaxation is warned by the horse. The shake of the harness and the sweeps that the horse makes it seem like if the horse is trying to save him. And when the horse asks if there's some mistake, Frost illustrates even further how the horse is the voice of reason, how logic can try to act as a check on impulsive emotional desires. In essence, the horse functions as the voice of duty and rational thinking, ensuring the speaker does not lose themselves in the enchanting words. This suggests that, even as the natural world and emotion tempt the reader towards escape, the horse serves as a reminder of societal obligations and the need to return to day-to-day demands of life, which also falls in line with the horse representing logic. Before the fruit of knowledge was eaten, logic, or at least the type shown here, could not have existed because there would have been no way to effectively weigh the objective value of an action. Frost, who would himself fall for the allures of nature, disregards the horse, considering society to be the result of shooting itself in the foot or making the mistake of eating the fruit. Similarly, the man still chooses to give into the seduction of the forest. Frost, who hated being a student due to the rules placed by society, dropped out twice. He makes it clear he does not like societal expectations and advocates for an idea similar to Taoism, where man attains peace with nature and himself. But in the end, the reason why this is Robert Frost's masterpiece is not because he put effort or time into it. In fact, he spent just a few minutes on it before finishing his publicized version. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening stands as Frost's ultimatum because it represents everything he stands for. The tranquility of nature, the societal demands of the horse, the personal wants of man, and most importantly, the power of poetry, which allows for so many variations upon variations and interpretations with this poem, and that is what Frost is remembered for today. Even though Frost is undoubtedly one of the largest influences in the American modernist movement, this does not stop criticism from coming his way. For the sake of myself, I'm just going to look at Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening because it is the best representation of his work. Here, critics often claim the poem is too simplistic or even conventional in its structures and themes, implying that it is not deserving of the glory and praise it gets, and that it's plain overrated. They suggest themes of life versus death or society versus nature are unchallenging. Steve Mont, for instance, critiques the poem for relying on familiar distinctions that might seem too fixed or too fluid, leading to a sense of predictability and potential discomfort. Similarly, some argue that Frost's conversational tone and straightforward imagery, like Little Horse and Downy Flake, lack any sort of complexity expected in serious poetry, implying that these details are really filler to preserve the poem's rhythm. However, I think these critiques fail to recognize just what Frost's intentions are, that is, to expand on the idea of the power of poetry. Mont's claim that the oppositions are overly fixed or fluid overlooks how Frost uses contrast, not to simplify life but to illustrate its contradictions. This poem is not about clear-cut binaries, but about the tensions of navigating life as it goes on. For example, the speaker's pause in the woods reflects a moment of deep thought, weighing the demands of duty and the wants of himself. This rings in everyone because everyone is special in their own way, meaning everyone differs from society in their own way. Frost knows this, and by having such big ideas, his poetry can be applied and resonate with anyone. Furthermore, I honestly think the critics' dismissal of Frost's imagery as too simple also misses the point. The little horse, for example, is not just an arbitrary detail. Once again, this can be interpreted in so many ways. Like literally, where the horse is just not in the man's focus because he is too zoned out. Metaphorically, where the horse does not matter to the man. And allegorically, where the man just does not care. It emphasizes the speaker's intimate connection to the natural world. And when Frost describes Downy Flake and Easy Win, he creates a story that reflects the man's desires, or the desire to be one with nature. These words are not filler, but essential in creating the mood and emotion the poem offers. To accuse Frost of sacrificing meaning for rhythm is to misunderstand the symbiosis between the two. The rhythm mirrors the speaker's attraction towards the woods, increasing the theatrical aspect/depth of the poem. Frost achieves his brilliance through his accessible style, which through ambiguity allows for the power of poetry to truly shine. His work is not simple just because he doesn't make his poems uber difficult to understand linguistically like other poets. His poems are complex, because of the amount of possible interpretations and ideas that can arise from one singular piece, which is what Frost stands for. Now, as a bonus, I want to go over Nothing Gold Can Say. And if this part sounds completely different, that's because it is. I wrote everything before this as an academic essay for my school, and then basically made a half-assed attempt at turning it into a script, so my analysis here might sound a bit more conversational. Anyways, the main reason I chose this poem is because of its prevalence in more relevant literature, shows, and frankly in general language. For example, in The Outsiders, Ponyboy tells Johnny to stay gold before he dies. In the episode Ozymandias from Breaking Bad, the poem is alluded to thematically. And even in casual conversation, the poem's title has become ubiquitous, and because it's so short, I'll go over it line by line. The poem starts with the line, "Nature's first green is gold," and simultaneously brings up a paradox. Seeing as green cannot physically be gold, the only way we can really interpret this is metaphorically. Usually, something green evokes a feeling of life, growth, and youth, while gold connotes value or beauty. By calling spring's first green gold, Frost suggests that the youth or initial moments of life are the most precious. But this is quite odd. We've already established how much Frost appreciates all of nature, especially with his poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. But for now, I'll put that aside and look through the rest of the poem. The next line is, "Her hardest hue to hold," which at least in my opinion, doesn't seem too hard to understand. After all, this whole poem is about how nothing gold can last. It makes sense that this line is just about how it's so hard to hold. It fades away rather quickly. However, I do think it is interesting to personify nature as her, because it makes me think that Frost is painting nature as a mother, struggling to hold onto the golden moment of her children, or possibly even herself. And to add on, the alliteration of H in her hardest hue to hold is also rather interesting. Now, I don't know if this is plain stupid, but I think the sound H makes is really interesting. Try to hold the H sound, then try to hold a sound like S or Z. Out of all of these sounds, H is honestly the hardest to hold because it's basically just breathing out. Even if it is arbitrary, I think it's pretty interesting. But more likely, the intended meaning was that as much as Frost tried to maintain his alliteration, by the end of the line, he could not hold onto the sound. The next line is, "Her early leaves a flower," which once again is another paradox. Early in spring, leaf buds bloom with a pale color, so Frost says it is a flower. But a leaf cannot literally be a flower, yet in the transient moment, it seems to be one. I think this still latches onto the idea that nature is a mother of some sort, where early leaf refers to a child. Flower, in my opinion, can have two different meanings. One is just nature's child is beautiful, whereas the other is how nature sees her child, as in how fast her child is growing. Seeing as how a flower can be seen as a sort of late stage, it may mirror how parents often watch their child growing up, mumbling in their head about how time flies and how their little budding is all grown up. Line 4 is, "But only so an hour." This line introduces a caveat. The flower, like leaf, lasts only so an hour. The word only and the mention of an hour shrink what might be a seasonal event into a matter of moments. Frost emphasizes how brief this perfection is, as if a season of growth is condensed into a single hour of golden light, almost like a golden hour. Now by itself, it doesn't really make any sense. Even if you believe that a quarter of a year isn't that long to admire the beauty, the years will repeat. However, if you look at it through childhood, it really does seem like a small bit of time. Also, I'd like to make a new connection here to Golden Hour. The lyrics of Golden Hour by Jake talk about a love story, referring to the love in his life as in her golden hour, which I think could be another way of looking at this poem. Now, I'm not exactly very well versed on history, but I do know that A, roughly during this time, World War I and World War II were occurring, and B, both of these wars were total wars, meaning everyone was dedicated to the war effort. Basically, I think this poem could be paying homage to the fact that while these two little flowers met, their golden time together only lasts an hour, with the man possibly going to enlist, and I guess maybe the woman gets pregnant, which could also signify the end of her golden hour. Now, I'm not saying that Golden Hour was inspired by this poem. In fact, there's a lot of contrasts One especially neat one being the fact that golden hour is played on a different frequency, and you can't create it naturally. But I'm also saying that golden hour brings a neat perspective to looking at this poem. Then leaf subsides to leaf. In line 5, the miracle has passed. The golden bust subsides back into an ordinary leaf, the very symbol of later spring when the trees are fully green. But notice how Frost uses the same word twice, as if exchanging one leaf for another. In fact, leaf and leaf are equal, almost like nothing is happening. In a more modern interpretation, I think this is a nice metaphor for how, as a child, everyone has their own abilities. In school, some are good at math, some are good at reading. You pick your own major based off what you like, what you're good at, yada yada. But as you grow older, you really kind of just blend into your field, only being another leaf that's exchangeable with companies. This also matches the previous line where the leaf turns into a flower, since as a kid, you really do shine in your own way. In fact, everyone is shining in their own way. But given time, you are all turned back into leaves. And of course, all leaves are different, sure, I'm not denying that. But I'm also willing to bet a lot of money that you can name different flowers better than you can name different leaves. Back to the poem though, I think another way to read it is through a stoic point of view, where the world doesn't exactly lose any vitality, but instead just changes form. In layman's terms, Frost is saying that the end of one beautiful stage is simply the beginning of the next. The next line is "So Eden sank to grief," which seems interesting, but is actually pretty common nowadays to include religious motifs. Frost here leaps from a single leap to a mythic scale. With "So Eden sank to grief," he alludes to the biblical Garden of Eden, which is where humanity lost their innocence by eating the apple, which I believe pairs pretty well with the previous idea that it symbolizes the end of someone's youth, or in other words, their innocence. But I think the poem also refers to the fact that Eden is a sort of gold, and just as the leaf must return to a plain leaf, Eden must fall because change is inevitable. It's still looking through the Stoic point of view. Frost also hints at a paradox. Each fall, like Eden's, makes way for something new, just as the golden buds and flowers of the Garden of Eden yield a full green leaf. And perhaps even connecting to the idea that this poem is about young couples, maybe refers to the fact that as a woman gives birth, she is perhaps losing her golden hour while giving birth to a new bud. The seventh line, "So dawn goes down to day," shifts to the daily cycle. Dawn, the golden moment before sunrise, is replaced by daylight. But something interesting is the use of "so." In fact, the previous line about Eden also used the word "so," implying that it is because of the line before the previous line, "the leaf subsides to leaf," that this is all happening. Which makes sense, because the leaves are now going back, its golden hour is ending. But interestingly, Frost says that dawn goes down today, even though the sun is rising. This reversal further deepens the paradox, the beautiful dawn that is descending into its own death. By using this language, Frost suggests that the rising sun on the horizon drags the dawn downward, and once again, this is consistent with the poem. After the golden hour that is dawn, the morning's golden promise is contingent on the coming day, which is responsible for the blooming of flowers and buds. In other words, the grandeur of the sunrise is real only because the dawn ends. This tells us that each bright beginning contains within it its own end, while also containing a new blooming flower. The final line is "Nothing gold can stay," which, to be honest, I can't really talk more about, seeing as this whole poem is basically a build-up towards this line. But I will say, the rhythm breaks here with an ellipses of sorts, as if even the foot of the line can't hold its shape, mirroring the poem's theme of impermanence. Now, remember when I said I talked about the alleged contradiction across between stopping by woods on a snowy evening and this poem? Well, I'd like to clarify that. Frost isn't complaining that things fade, or more specifically, he's not complaining that a part of nature is fading. He's saying that's what makes them beautiful. The woods in the second poem are lovely because he can't linger. The golden leaf is precious because it fades. Frost does love nature deeply, but he never sugarcoats it. He doesn't romanticize nature as something that stays perfect forever. He sees it as a mirror for how things actually are: gorgeous, fleeting, gentle, and harsh. kind and cruel all at once. All of this actually aligns really well with my previous explanation of his childhood, where in the fields of New England, he realizes the duality of nature. Despite the numerous critiques of his seemingly dull writing, Robert Frost's poetry is the embodiment of individualism amidst the turbulence of World War I, cementing him as a pioneer of American modernism. Before this video ends, I'd like to talk about some of the channels that really helped me write this analysis. Once again, thank you to DieZ Chalkx for your analysis on Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Thank you to Poetry Now! For his analysis on The Road Not Taken. Thank you to Poetry Foundation, which really doesn't need my shout out, but thank you for all the sources and poetry guides. And I'll post any documents I used in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I'm not trying to make this into a full-time thing, but it does bring me joy seeing the numbers go up. And it also took me quite a while to make this video, so I would really appreciate if you did. Thank you.